Underway. Uh, and can I also request my colleagues on the left side of the room to close the doors so that we could have all your attention to this session. Thank you. Look, this session is essentially a conversation between five very smart people. I actually would take a step ahead and say it's between five think tankers. Dr. Jaishankar is not a foreign minister, he's actually a think tanker. And he's pretending to be a foreign minister. So I am now going to ask him to manifest his think tank hat here and get into a conversation with his colleagues on questions of world affairs. And I think there's lots to talk about in the world today. And the good news for all of you is that I will only ask one question through the entire morning. The rest of the questions are going to be amongst themselves. And I'm going to kick this off by actually posing a question to the foreign minister. Foreign minister, you are someone who's made foreign policy more relatable to people. You have used grammar, vocabulary, and even imagery that makes people, young people especially, become more interested in some very complex and complicated discussions that are underway. People feel involved in foreign policy today. Most recently, your book, Why Bharat Matters, has dived deep into some of our oldest stories as children growing up in this country to make complex contemporary questions more interesting for them. But for a foreign policy audience, what are the big takeaways from your book, from your recent book? What are your 4 or 5 big takeaways for the world we live in today?
Okay. Clearly, you're taking the think tank bit seriously. So, what are the takeaways? One, I think the really serious problems are stemming from the economic vulnerabilities of the world. My case is for re-globalization, where supply chains, where concentrations, where digital vulnerabilities are better addressed. So, and I push that because we are really focused much more on the obvious challenges, the war in Ukraine, what's happening in Gaza, the COVID. So my point is the economic fragilities, the economic dependencies are actually the really serious threat to the world. The second point would be that in a way, the beware of the normal. We tend to focus on the exceptional situations, but actually there's a daily, erosion or a daily danger or a daily insecurity created by the normal. So watch where the normal is going, because every day in our lives we are doing things which expose us more and more, particularly in a technology-dependent world. The third relates to the mind games. So, competition has many forms, but one of them are the mind games which accompany. It's like any competitive activity. So, all these indexes which you get, ratings, how democratic are you, how good's your press, how good's your civil rights. So this is like the equivalent of sledging in cricket. It's meant to psych you before you get ready for doing anything. So I'm saying that particularly looking at Michael.
No, but in the political sphere, the Americans are the biggest sledgers, not the Australians.
Well, that we can discuss on a cricket aside.
Okay.
And the fourth, which is part of the reason for the title of the book, is we in India need to think the solutions. In fact, frankly, even the analysis for ourselves, rather than kind of, I'm not against imparted wisdom, but I think we need delving into our own history, traditions, culture, and our own application of mind. Come up with our own answers to the world.
So, Dr. Jaishankar, we are going to keep coming back to you because they are going to be asking you some questions. And I would expect you to pose some cryptic puzzles for them to solve as well. So, let me get this going. And let me first start with Michael Fullilove, who's heading a very nifty institute in Sydney, Lowy Institute. Michael, you have the first shot.
All right. First of all, I want to take the opportunity to thank Samir and ORF for bringing us all together at this amazing bazaar of international policy. I'm really enjoying it. I'm honoured to be on a panel with this panel, but especially with Dr. Jaishankar. We've known each other for a long time. We've had many exchanges on cricket and foreign policy. Let me take this opportunity to wish India luck in the 4th Test against England. I think that's one thing on which Australia and India agree, that is, we like to see England lose cricket matches. I also like the analogy between cricket and foreign policy because in cricket, Australia is a great power. Let me come to great power competition because that's what I want to ask you about. Great power competition has come roaring back over the past decade. Geopolitics is back. At the same time, wealth and power have moved eastwards towards our part of the world. And China's growth has comprised the largest element of that. There's a massive concentration of wealth in China. And that same period, which has coincided with Xi Jinping's period in power, has also seen China become much more aggressive in the waters to its east and south, in its relations with its neighbours, notably India, also Australia. But in truth, China has been at daggers drawn with many of its neighbours at different times over the past decade. And I would argue that the severity of China's behaviour has seen a few effects in our part of the world. First of all, other Asian countries seeking to step up and expand their freedom of movement and to make new friends, do things in different ways, because none of us wants to live in China's shadow. Secondly, institutional developments. For example, the elevation of the Quad. I would say both the Quad and AUKUS were made in China, Minister. And finally, connections between capable Asian countries like India and Australia getting stronger. So there's the context. Now let me ask you 2 questions about China, because I think China is at the heart of a lot of this strategic flux. First of all, let me ask you about relations between China and India. You told us at the inaugural session that we should listen, like Mr. Modi, the importance of listening and reflecting. I've listened during this conference. I heard the Indian Defence Secretary say that China was a bully. I heard you say, I think, that the biggest opposer of UN Security Council reform is not a Western country, which I guess might possibly refer to China. China, I think, is a preoccupation of yours. What is the settling point of the relationship between China and India? Is there a settling point? And secondly, let me ask you about the relationship between China and Russia. The Ukraine war has pushed China and Russia together. It seems to me there's a lot of confidence here in India that eventually they will pull apart again because they're different countries with different interests. But I wonder if there's some overconfidence there. Mr. Putin is on his high horse at the moment, but I think in the long term he understands that Russia is the junior partner in that relationship. China's economy is closing on America's economy. Meanwhile, Russia is in danger of being overtaken by Australia's economy.
Michael,
what if, let me finish. What if the China-Russia relationship strengthens? What if it doesn't turn out in the way that India hopes?
Okay. You just introduced a thought in my head, which is people say that the Quad is directed against somebody. And it struck me that, yes, all 4 of us have had problems with the UK. So, think about it. But 3 of us have actually kind of fought a war. Yeah. But more seriously, where, what would be the, where would India, China finally find a equilibrium or a balance? It will, here's the problem. Both of us are rising, obviously at a different pace with different starting points. I think the Chinese started off earlier, much more, much more intensively and robustly than we did. But it's in the nature of things that, at some stage everybody flattens out, so there'll be a period where they'll be flattening out and we'll be growing. I'm not in denial of, what the numbers today suggest, but if one looks, for example, at the Goldman Sachs prediction, which is that we'll both really, by about 2075, end up as $50 trillion economy plus, and will be the two closest to each other. Now, the international relations version of that issue would be, if both of us are moving vis-a-vis each other and vis-a-vis the world, how do we construct an equilibrium? That there will be occasions when one or the other would want to change, to do something to press home a particular advantage, and the other will resist it. Here's the immediate issue, which is, from the 1980s, really, late 80s, we had an understanding on the border precisely because it suited both of us. Now, there was a departure after after 30 years, a departure on their side in terms of how they behaved on the border. And there's a pushback from our side. So I think management, arriving at equilibriums, then maintaining those, refreshing those, is going to be one of the biggest challenges for both countries. It's not going to be easy. The bit which, the mind games which will be played would be, it's just between the two of us. There's nobody, the other 190 odd countries in the world don't exist in our relationship. That will be the mind game which will be played. I don't think we should play it. Because if there are other factors out there in the world which can be harnessed by me to get better terms on an equilibrium, why should I forego that right? So part of, today, when I say think through your own solutions, is don't give another country, which is clearly a competitive country, a veto over our policy choices. And unfortunately, in the past, that has happened from time to time. So we should be confident enough to leverage the international system to create the best possible outcome. Your second issue, Russia-China. It's kind of funny. On the one hand, you have people whose sets of policies bring the two together. And then you say, beware of them coming together. So, okay, I mean, I can see the reality out there, but I think it's very much in, certainly in Indian national interest, but I would suggest actually in global interest, that when Russia, what's happened today with Russia is essentially a lot of doors have been shut to Russia and the West. Okay, we know the reasons why. Russia is turning more to Asia or to parts of the world which are not West. Now, I think it makes sense to give Russia multiple options. If we railroad Russia into a single option and say, that's really bad because that's the outcome, then you are making it a kind of a self-fulfilling prophecy. So today, I think it's important for other countries, especially in Asia, to engage Russia, to remind Russia. And look, Russia is a power with an enormous tradition of statecraft. such powers would never put themselves, into a single relationship of a overwhelming nature. It would go against their grain.
Yeah, sir, you have a right to ask him a question as well, but maybe you could pose a question once we've been through the first round, and maybe one or two for all of them to respond to. Leslie, can I turn to you? Or maybe I should go to my friend from Nigeria, Osage. Can you pose a question to the foreign minister? Osage heads the Nigerian Institute of Foreign Affairs. He was with me recently in New York. I really enjoyed his interventions. Over to you.
And we were just together, Your Excellency. Let me thank the ORF and the Ministry of External Affairs for this invitation. It's a great privilege to be here. And I'm happy that we can continue the conversation that you set in motion in Lagos when you were at our institute 2 weeks ago. Now, the point is about multilateralism and the place of the UN, and especially United Security Council in all the things. These are inflection points in world history when perhaps we need world bodies, world platforms that can help us create the kinds of stability that the world so very urgently requires. Now, this month, it will be 2 years since the war in Ukraine started, and the UN doesn't seem to be any closer to finding a solution in spite of all that we're doing. And what seems to be happening in all the subjects that we're dealing with is that people are now finding alternatives to the UN. And yet here we are, we insist that the UN holds the balance, if you like, for all the kinds of things that we're doing. The UN itself is a reflection of the power structure, of the global power structure, which resonates all of the colonialities and the colonial forms and so on. So there's a school of thought that says when you ask for UN reforms, you're actually in the vortex of decolonization. Now it's interesting that India has pushed along these lines, and the African Union is fully in support of what India is doing. Now, the UN reforms, what do you want to see? Inclusivity is important, representation is important, but so is legitimacy and credibility. Now that the UN seems to be waning in its influence, what is driving India's point about how to reform the UN? Now, that's one. The second thing is, in a reformed UN, how would we ensure that the Global South, stops being a spectator? So the Global South is not simply led, by others whose interests subordinate the interests of the Global South. Is this something to suggest that you would have a multi-track that has the UN along with BRICS, along with all the other regional organizations and all the other multilateral platforms working together, or should we continue to balance things around the UN?
Dr. Jaishankar.
It's interesting thought, and it's your thought, which I'm capturing here. I think all of you heard him say that reform of UN is actually connected to decolonization. And what I guess you mean by that is, so long as Africa and Latin America and parts of the decolonized Asia are not adequately and appropriately reflected, the UN is still actually a reflection of a colonial era organization. So I think it's a great idea. I really think that posing the reform issue in terms of perpetuating a colonial era is something which we all need to think about. But on the UN reform itself, there's actually been progress. It was interesting. I think you had a pre-panel
Yes.
of there's a IGN process, the Intergovernmental Negotiation Process. The chairs of that are Kuwait and Austria. And the chairs were visiting India. They participated in a panel before this conference.
It was a curtain raiser, actually.
Formally began. And what is happening right now is we have finally moved the needle to a point where different models of how to reform the UN are being presented before the UN. There's a Mexico model. There's a Liechtenstein model. I don't know if the foreign minister of Liechtenstein is here in the audience. She was here at the conference yesterday. I spoke to her. There's an L69 model, of which India is also part, which is largely a global south view. I think Nigeria is also part of it. The G4 will give theirs. Africa will present it. So actually, finally, we've reached a point where very specific views of the key elements of reform, that's being heard in a way. Now, we'll have to see, okay, after you hear everybody out, what's the next step? Where do you go? That's not clear as yet. But we certainly, we have a strong view about the need for reform. We will put those views forward. When you have 200 odd members, it makes sense that the body will hear everybody out, and we will come to some kind of middle ground. I mean, that's what diplomacy and negotiations are about. But again, there's a very clever mind game being played, which is, how can we reform the body unless we have consensus? That's like saying, how can I take the exam because I don't know the result? So this is another way of perpetuating what you clearly pointed out was a colonized United Nations.
In fact, the UN process is perhaps the only process where you need a consensus before you can make the first draft. The draft itself requires a consensus. So it's interesting. Leslie, let me turn to you.
First of all, let me echo Michael's words and others. First of all, thank you to Samir. This is tremendous, and it's a real honor to be here, and it's especially an honor to be on a panel with you, Dr. Jaishankar. I want to ask a question about the G20. I was very lucky and fortunate. Samir gave me the opportunity to be a member of the Think 20 Task Force 7 on Reformed Multilateralism, and for me it was a year of coming to India on multiple occasions, to different parts of India, to listen to a really diverse set of voices, not only from India, but from all of the participants from the multiple countries who engaged in that. But I also got to listen to you and many of the things that you said. And in Mysuru at the final Think 20 summit, you always have very good lines. I think we all listen to you and follow you in part for those. But one of the things, a couple of the things you said, one was the G7, and you paused, it is important, but the world has moved on, and it's really the G20 that shows us the breadth and diversity and the diverse power, of course, although you don't use the word power, of the world. And so the G20 is tremendously important. But you also said that and this reflected my experience watching it, you said that that India's G20 was about two things. It was about getting India ready for the world, and it was about getting the world ready for India. And I thought this was tremendously revealing of actually the year that I had experienced. But I guess my question for you is, as you think ahead, there's been as Samir always says, there's been a wonderful run of Global South leadership of the G20 from Indonesia to India to Brazil, to South Africa. But as we look at 2026, the picture looks different. It goes to the United States. So when we get to 2026, the UN Security Council probably won't have been reformed.
No, are you suggesting by 2026 the US will be Global South?
I do believe, Samir, having not grown up in New York or Washington, that there are parts of the Global South within the United States, and I encourage you to find them. I've traveled around India. Let's take you around the US. But as you get to 2026, India is currently the 5th largest economy. My SOAS students from India were thrilled in that moment because we were in the classroom when that was announced. The 3rd largest military spender. Maybe those categories will shift, probably in one direction if they do, but India's power is undeniable. But it will be in a moment where, at some level, its sense of leadership and of Global South leadership, and India being at the helm of that, might not have a platform. And so I'm curious, what does that mean for a country that is, although again, I don't hear you talk about the word power very often, but what does that mean for a country like India that is so distinctive and so powerful? And also, what does it mean after this year, this past year, where the expectation, I mean, we all know it's extraordinary. You get off the airplane and you see G20 or you see T20. It's not even in the airport. You go around the cities, and that sort of signage, the posting, has created an awareness amongst Indians of India's global leadership. And quite frankly, I cannot imagine a US in 2026 having signs about the G20 in Des Moines or in Ohio or anywhere else.
We can help them with that.
So what happens when you get to that stage?
I think the second question is, are you having withdrawal symptoms? Or are you seeing greater demand from India for global leadership? I think that's the point she's asking, because you've raised the bar so high, people expect
and
you to...
where do you go? And
where do you go
now?
now?
When you're not shut out, but when you're sort of not leading in the way that you should be leading?
Okay. My first comment would be, yes, G7, the G7 to G20 was the big change of the last decade. But what we realized was that G20 was not enough, because one part of the world with more than 50 countries had been significantly shut out, which was Africa. So if you see, in a way, we still call it G20, but it's actually become G21. And that itself, by the way, in a way, it's also a lesson to the UN that if the G20 could expand, so could the P5. But it will be a process of change. I mean, that's what the world is about. The world is really about more prosperity, more production, much broader dispersal of economic and political power, in a way. So I can see that happening, when the sort of smoke clears and people look back on this G20, it will surely be recognized for the fact that the African Union membership was agreed upon. My second comment, why did I say, this whole thing about getting India ready for the world and the world ready for India? We've had foreign policy events before. We've had gatherings before. They have been largely restricted to the formal processes of diplomacy, mainly in the capital city. I've attended pretty much all the G20s since 2015. I missed one. That was my gap year in the government. In that period, we saw how others conducted the G20. And we felt this time that this was an extraordinary opportunity, one, to get the people of India, especially the young people of India, interested in foreign policy. Now, the best way of interesting people in foreign policy is to do exactly what you saw, which is go to, the cities and towns across India and, do activities there, put up signages, get them involved in a way. So, if you actually took part in some of these activities, you had a conference going on, the formal G20 meeting, but there was a lot of other stuff going on in the same city at the same time. The other part of it is, for much of the world, India meant Delhi. It could mean sort of the golden triangle, the tourist triangle. It could mean Mumbai, maybe Bengaluru. But that was it. Now, when you actually had G20 delegates going to 60 cities. And in every case, we made sure they went somewhere else outside that city. This was also displaying India. So it was a very conscious effort on our part, you can say, to globalize society, to prepare, when you are talking about, the leadership, what will you be doing as you go up in the pecking order? To do that, you have to prepare a society. You have to prepare a people for the responsibilities which come. And in a sense, we were using the G20 exercise for that purpose. So would we kind of step up? Because, that's really what you are asking. My sense is yes. I mean, if you look even at the last 10 years, we have been much more frequently a first responder than we've ever been before in our lives. Today, anything which broadly happens between, say, East Africa till about, the Australia, that broad region, the expectation is somewhere in some form India would respond. And that's actually been the record of the last 10 years, sometimes beyond, we went into Turkey during the earthquake there as well. So in different, an India of ideas. So you have Solar Alliance, you have the Coalition for Disaster Resilient Infrastructure, and India, which is a kind of a, here there's a culture, tradition, history as well. The idea of propagating millets, for example. Don't think of it as a food fad. The millets is the only way by which global grain production can be significantly increased in a short time, given the natural, usage of resources that we have. So it could be millets, it could be yoga, it could be solar, it could be terrorism, it could be black money. You today see an India which is really, pushing and trying to get itself and its ideas on the global stage.
And what about the pressure from young people who now want more from you? Every time you are traveling, every time you are at work, they expect miracles.
Sorry, I couldn't hear you there.
They expect miracles from you. They expect the extraordinary from you. The expectations have been raised. How do you deal with that? I mean, how do you respond to that kind of pressures? Because you've got so many people interested in foreign policy, now everyone has a view.
Well, that's good, isn't it? There'll be more Samirs coming out of that process.
Okay. You don't want more Samirs, but let me turn to Bruce Jones.
I'm dazzled by the prospect, actually. Thank you for having me here. And terrific to be on the panel with you, Dr. Jaishankar, and with the rest of the crew. I do notice I work for an American institution. I am an American. I'm also Canadian. Leslie works for a British institution, but she's secretly also an American. So I noticed that Samir only has former colonials on the stage for this discussion, which may be appropriate. Look, I wanted to ask you about India's leadership here. I mean, we have some pretty serious challenges ahead of us. Deterring great power war, managing great power competition, I think a much deeper conceptualization and driving of reglobalization than has been discussed so far, driving a deeper reform and adaptation of the treaty-based order that can survive to some degree. No one state can do all of that. India has important roles to play, but there are other actors that I think that can contribute: the Brazils, the Indonesias, the Turkeys, etc., as well as some of the European and Western middle powers and major powers, the Canadians, Australians, etc., Spain. What prospects do you see for greater collaboration among that set of actors, the kind of the major powers that aren't the ones who are really driving great power competition? I mean, you're an actor in great power competition too, but you're not the primary drivers of it. What scope is there for collaboration among that kind of group of major powers, major and middle powers, that have deeply vested interests in the survival of the system, even if the system needs to change quite a lot?
So you're talking here of the P5?
No, I'm saying, how do you think about collaboration among the kind of set of actors below
minus
that?
G2. You remove the G2,
Yeah.
Can the others create safe spaces for globalization, for international relations?
And for managing great power competition.
You have I mean, first of all, I'm not sure the G2, I mean, the G2 will always be a concern. I'm not sure how realistic a concern it would be given the way things are going. Then you have, in a sense, at least from a UN perspective, the P3, the non-G2. And then you have this set of, you can say, middle powers, upper middle powers. One neat category would actually be the G20 countries. But you know, I also give due weight to Nigeria here. But let us say there are those roughly 10 odd countries which would be G20 countries of regional influence. Yeah. You know, my sense is you're going to see both lateral and to some degree vertical collaborations. Some of the collaborations would come from pre-existing architecture. I mean, you have alliances. The alliances or groupings, I mean, the EU allows a lot of countries to coordinate. The NATO allows a lot of countries to coordinate. Australia, Japan, by virtue of their treaty alliances, treaty relationships, do that. The interesting ones would be the loners, in a way, the ones who are not embedded in a pre-existing structure. And you can see that in different ways they are both expanding options, but also trying to forge something common. I give you a few examples. I mean, if you look at, say, BRICS expansion, some of the countries that showed interest and have actually moving in that direction, I mean, take something like Saudi Arabia. So Saudi Arabia is clearly widening its options. The UAE is widening its options. But at the same time, these loner countries, these independent countries, through initiatives like IMEC, are working, you know,
together.
So they're also trying to forge, I would say, common ground on a particular set of issues. So you're going to see, you know, they would appear to be contradictory trends. To my mind, they are not. I think, to me, it's more like the natural diversity of the world finally escaping the clutches of a discipline imposed after the Cold War. So the Cold War really, you know, compelled or, you know, incentivized a whole lot of countries to come together very tightly. That's now loosening up. There'll be consequences. A lot of countries will now, you know, try to have multiple options. And then once, even as they do that, they will form combinations of their own. And that's really going to make international relations very interesting.
Is India willing to lead that effort?
Is India willing to lead
that effort?
No, I don't think anybody can lead that effort. You know, my sense is you'll get combinations. We would try to be involved in, as you know, a lot of foreign policy is to be involved in as many of these enterprises and initiatives and groupings as possible. So it's a sort of, you know, in my book, I've actually described it as making friends and influencing people. So how are you ideally omnipresent, omni-relevant, and that's also today, I would say, a new way of conducting foreign policy.
So, Dr. Jaishankar, if I was to ask you to pose a question to these very fine minds and give them, say, 30 seconds or 40 seconds to respond to that one inquiry that you would like to hear from or seek their inputs on, what would that be for them?
Well, I think for Michael, I mean, from an Indian perspective, the real issue as we look forward at India, Australia is, in a way, how much Australia is Indo-Pacific and how much Australia is Western. I think that's the duality which most people would be interested in.
Well, let me answer that. Let me say I had one, two,
Michael, I'll give you your turn.
Okay.
And for Leslie?
No, let him answer that. I'll think of
I'm running out of time, and hence
Okay,
I'm going to give Michael the last word to come because he started first. But do you have questions for any others that we can take and then go to them and close?
Well, I think what I would, in a sense, urge you to articulate, because given Nigeria's today importance, is within, we tend to talk about Africa, but I mean, you look at Nigeria, which is a significant power in its own right. What would be the next set of countries coming up? How do they plan their rise? Because that is something which is clearly awaiting you.
And to Bruce?
Bruce,
2026 America.
I'm tempted to ask him a Canadian question, but then I get into trouble. So I just want to confirm that I have your good wishes that Indo-Canadian relations would continue to improve.
Okay, so Bruce, that's a cue for you to respond to something. And what about Leslie?
Yeah, I would be really curious because you clearly got immersed very deeply in the G20 experience. So I would be curious to get that sense from you, and in a way to Michael also, because Lowy had put out a study, I think, on how young Indians
think about foreign policy.
Are interested in foreign policy. Because I think that's really today, in the coming elections, almost 90 million young Indians would be voting for the first time. That's how significant their impact is going to be in this country. So I'd be very interested from your travels to get that impression, what was the impact? What do you see? Because I'm giving you my version of what I tried to do. Did I succeed?
Okay.
Did we really get people interested?
Great. So I think let's start with Bruce. Come to you, Osage, then come to Leslie, and I'll give Michael the final word. You all have 45 seconds to 1 minute each for your final interventions this afternoon. After which I'll start singing, so you should avoid that.
So
But Bruce, let's start.
as a Canadian, look, the thing I would raise is the really important role through the Cold War and in the post-Cold War that was played by major powers and middle powers in quiet diplomacy to help the great powers manage de-escalation, and in innovation in the multilateral space. The creation of new instruments like peacekeeping, et cetera, was always done by major powers or middle powers working quietly. Canada did that, Australia did that, India did that at an earlier phase, and I think that role is extraordinarily important in the years ahead, so something to reflect on and look at.
Osage?
Yes, thank you. When you talk about emerging countries in Africa, and you say after Nigeria, which are the other countries, you can have a good lineup. South Africa, Kenya, Ghana, Egypt, Algeria, Morocco. All of these countries are there, but there is something that makes Africa a little exceptional. It is the consensus building that is traditional to Africa as a value. And so the African Free Trade Agreement, for instance, provides a very strong cement for all of that continent. And you would find even in the BRICS, you have found it necessary to admit AU rather than another country, for instance. I think it's a reflection of how very strong the African consensuses have been over the times. And you see what the regional bodies are doing, SADC, the IGAD, the ECOWAS, and so on. So it's not simply and only about individual countries emerging anymore. So we have to be simultaneous, in dealing with Africa. We're dealing with, these regional organizations alongside, those powers. And you will find that the evolving powers in Africa are themselves seriously located within those regional frames.
Excellent. Leslie?
Yes, so I think undoubtedly my experience would suggest that you succeeded on the back of a very strong base of young people, not least the Raisina young fellows, but really there is an extraordinary base on which to build. If you can actually get those 90 million young people to turn out and vote, that would certainly be a level of success that the democracy that I'm most familiar with struggles with, getting its young voters.
90 million.
19.
90, 90.
90.
Yes, 90 million. I mean, that in itself would be extraordinary, and if you've helped to shift the balance on why they're voting, then that's quite powerful. I think when you know, the thing that I think you feel most, at least I feel
Look,
most...
if you were one of the 90 million, will you vote for Dr. Jaishankar or not? I think
we're gonna bring you to our intellectual circles in the West, but even as a member of the non-West, as opposed to the anti-West. But you know, there's a lot to play for here. The energy and the dynamism and the willingness of the young Indians I've encountered to work literally around the clock is truly refreshing, and I hope it's never lost with labor laws as much as we need them. But I guess the question on the international stage, have you succeeded, would also, and on the domestic, is can you meet those expectations in the next phase? Because the G20 was, you know, 1 year, and there is a continuity, as I mentioned. But the question, I guess, beyond that is also that people are looking not only to see whether India steps up, but also to see whether this sort of not taking a position is sustainable. I flinch every time I see one of my colleagues in the US or the UK talk about India as a swing state, as a fence sitter, or as a hedger. I find it very patronizing. The Indian part of myself finds that very patronizing. But there is something to it, and you capture it as saying non-West and working on multiple formats. But I think that the world is still waiting to see whatever India's values are, we have some sense of them. Will they inform its foreign policy, and will India really step up to lead? And I think young people will look for that leadership, because it's the thing that, you know, beyond materialism and access, it's the thing that really inspires people to do more.
Michael.
You asked me, is Australia part of the West or is it part of Asia? And the answer is we're both. We're both. And I don't think any of us as individuals or countries has one single identity. I like Tottenham Hotspur. I'm a jazz fan. I like the South Sydney Rabbitohs. We all have multiple identities, and as long as they're self-reinforcing, that's fine. And I think Australia's alliance with the United States makes us a more relevant and interesting partner for Asian countries, and our knowledge of and deep engagement with the Pacific and Asia makes us a more useful ally. Final point, Samir. I know you love fresh ideas. You're always pushing us for one idea. I had a fresh idea on this panel during the interesting conversation about UN security reform. I'm glad to hear there's been some progress at the margins, but sometimes with these difficult diplomatic negotiations, you just need an out-of-the-box idea. So my out-of-the-box idea is that we could base Security Council membership on ICC test rankings. And this would be great for India, it would be fabulous for Australia, and it would encourage the growth of cricket in other parts of the world. So would you support me on that, Minister?
Dr. Jaishankar, you have to respond now.
Yes. I think it's got the kernel of a good idea, but I think the better solution would be to leave it to BCCI.
That is a good way to end this panel. And ladies and gentlemen, please join me in applauding this wonderful conversation this morning. Thank you all for being here. Can we take a photograph on the top of the stage?